Typically, every year has a handful of key moments that come to define it. The last 12 months have served up so many world-changing ones that are likely to be forever etched in history. From a virus outbreak that swept furiously across the world, urging a new paradigm in our daily routines, to a divisive election that saw a record turnout, we took a look back at what 2020 had in store for
The fire
us.
catastrophe in Australia, where the nation's largest evacuation is now underway. The death toll rising, and tonight the staggering toll on the nation's wildlife.
It all started by an Australian bushfire. Australia is no stranger to bushfires, but the bushfire that engulfed the land down under in 2020 were nothing like we have ever seen before.
And over very, very quickly now. Here it comes, here it comes, here it comes. Get the fucking front going! Burn over, Scotty, burn over! Burn over, Scotty!
According to research published in the Nature Climate Change Journal by March, approximately 21% of Australian forests, excluding Tasmania, has been burned in the bushfire season that began in late 2019. A devastating cocktail of soaring temperatures and extreme drought caused scorching on an unprecedented scale that, as per some reports, displaced or killed a staggering 3 billion animals, including mammals, reptiles, birds, and frogs. The catastrophic event spotlight the growing anthropogenic effects on the climate and the urgent need to implement adaptation and resilient solutions in anticipation of similar events. Impeachment of Donald Trump.
Impeachment for that. Now, Donald Trump has become only the third US president to be impeached.
US President Trump's presidency has been littered with one controversy after another, but it all came to a head in late December 2019 when he became the third president in American history to be formally impeached, with a majority of House representatives voting in favor of 2 articles of impeachment tabled by the Democrats alleging the abuse of executive power and obstruction of Congress. The trial was initiated in mid-January and continued until February 5, when President Trump was acquitted on both counts by the US Senate. However, it only served to highlight the deep partisan divisions among the American public that would later manifest in the run-up to the November elections.
This lawless partisan impeachment is a political suicide march for the Democrat Party. Have you seen my polls in the last 4 weeks?
The COVID-19 pandemic. There's no other way to put it. The pandemic fundamentally transformed life around the planet in ways never before imagined. Beginning as an outbreak in Wuhan, China, it wasn't long before the virus swept across nations, sending economies into tailspins, stuck markets crashing, and business into comas while grounding fleets of planes, forcing schools to shut and driving people into their homes. As the world struggled to adopt an entirely new vocabulary, littered with terms like social distancing, quarantine, flattening the curve, and herd immunity, it soon became clear how ill-prepared we were for a crisis of this nature and magnitude. The COVID-19 virus has infected millions and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in the 11 months. In the 12 months since the World Health Organization officially diagnosed the outbreak as a pandemic, only a handful of countries have managed to contain its dangerous spread, while multiple resurgences have already been witnessed in the US and several other European nations. Following China's publishing of the virus genomic data, vaccine research has taken place at a historic speed, the fruits of which we are now witnessing, with the UK becoming the first country officially approve a vaccine earlier this month. However, the quest to vaccinate the world will not be an easy one, and for many, the new normal is likely to persist, at least for several more months, as the elderly and most vulnerable are prioritized in vaccine rollout programs. The Black Lives Matter movement. In the mid of the pandemic, a new kind of unrest began to bubble in May, triggered by the death of an African American man named Ahmaud Arbery by US law enforcement officials in Brunswick, Georgia. The case resembled that of several others where unarmed black men who had been gunned down by the police or others seeking some form of vigilant justice. Later that month, the crisis was compounded when a video emerged of another unarmed black man, George Floyd, being suffocated and killed during an encounter with the Minneapolis police. The penny had finally dropped. Thousands of protesters calling for police reform flooded the streets, and clashes between demonstrators and the police were witnessed all across the country. The roaring protests turned global by June, with protests seen in several other countries including Germany, France, Brazil, South Africa, Australia, and the United Kingdom, under the overarching banner of Black Lives Matter.
This new national security law for Hong Kong has been greeted with protests in the territory and condemnation from the international community. The legislation passed yesterday gives Beijing powers to shape life in Hong Kong as never before.
In June, the Chinese parliament passed a controversial new national security law to take effect in the special administrative region of Hong Kong, sparking mass outrage in the city as pro-democracy demonstrators took the street in protest. The sweeping law, which relates to secession, terrorism, foreign intervention, and subversion, will, as many analysts have contended, greatly erode the democratic nature of Hong Kong and radically tighten the Beijing stranglehold on the city. Hong Kong had been overwhelmed by protests since 2019 when the law was first tabled in Parliament. But having gained worldwide attention, the Hong Kong protests have since become a blueprint for several other protests around the world. The US presidential elections. In early November, with unemployment at its highest in recent memory and the US economy still reeling from the virus outbreak, the nation's citizens flocked to the polling booths to determine whether President Trump deserved a second term or whether the presidential baton will be passed to his Democratic rival Joe Biden. A record voter turnout and historic numbers of mail-in ballots eventually saw Joe Biden defeat President Trump in what appeared to be a straightforward victory. However, President Trump sought to break with centuries of US tradition when he refused to concede the presidency, instead activating the judiciary as he probed into possible election fraud. His efforts have largely been in vain, with the US Supreme Court throwing out over 50 of the lawsuits his Republican camp have filed. President Trump's more recent statements indicate that reality may finally be dawning on him, but in the face of several investigations around him, from tax fraud to rape, it remains to be seen whether he will seek a means to pardon himself before he vacates the Oval Office. Pfizer and Moderna's vaccine breakthroughs. Typically, it can take several years and even decades before a vaccine gains full approval to be rolled out. Vaccines have to undergo a series of trials to evaluate their safety and efficiency that often involve hundreds of thousands of participants. But the urgency of the crisis meant that governments across the world tore up conventional regulatory protocols, drawing up new ones that lubricated a path towards the swift development of vaccines. The last year has seen thousands of pieces of research literature published in the pursuit of a COVID-19 vaccine, so much that researchers have often had to use big data technologies to identify research that may be relevant to their own studies. In early November, though, we received what was possibly the best news of the year when US pharma company Pfizer, in collaboration with BioNTech, announced that its mRNA-based vaccine candidate was found to be 95% effective against the COVID-19 virus. This was followed by Moderna's announcement that its own candidate had proved to be 94% effective. With both manufacturers seeking emergency use approval in several countries and the UK already approving Pfizer's vaccine, it does appear like the end of the pandemic may finally be upon us after a torturous year. However, the key challenges remain not just as they relate to vaccine storage and delivery, but equitable distribution too. In the short term, it is inevitable that global demand will outstrip vaccine supply, but the hope is that with a multi-tiered and calculated approach, immunization can be carried out rapidly. And let's hope for the best.